Morning, everyone, and happy World Diabetes Day. I have a pleasure of facilitating today for Cathy Breen. She's famous in the diabetes world because she's offering a second-to-none diabetes service as a dietitian in St. Columcille's Hospital in Loughlinstown. I want to say that everyone's contribution today is welcome. Please, as Gráinne has said, use the Q&A button at the bottom or indeed the chat button at the side. I will be monitoring all of that, making sure everyone's being civil, of course, and any questions I will then pose with Cathy at the end. Cathy has asked that we answer questions at the end just to let her to get into the momentum of her presentation today. So Cathy, if you're ready, I'm very pleased to hand over to you because you have far more important things to say than I. So please, everyone, welcome Cathy Breen today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cormac. I'm going to do share screen and hopefully then we'll be up and running. And
Cathy, I hope you're going to tell me now I can still eat chocolate at the end of this talk.
Absolutely. One of my favorite foods, Cormac.
Oh, it is. I could give up anything, Cathy, but just not chocolate, I promise. You have to promise me that.
Promise, absolutely. Am I okay there with my slides? Can everyone see them and we're good?
Yep, you're up and running there, Cathy.
Okay, super. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for all logging on so early, and especially thank you to the Thriveabetes team for inviting me to speak on the topic of carb counting. It's a real honor to be asked here today. So as Cormac said, I work as a dietitian. I've specialized in the areas of diabetes and obesity over the last 15 years, and in my diabetes world, specifically in type 1 diabetes. So these are my disclosures. I've received honoraria and CPD sponsorship from the spectrum, I suppose, of diabetes pharma over the years. I don't live with type 1 diabetes myself. I am very conscious that as healthcare professionals, we can get very wrapped up in the numbers and physical health with diabetes. So in my own practice, I really do try to value and prioritize mental health with diabetes as much as physical health. I'm going to use this symbol throughout my presentation to denote that. As I alluded to with the chocolate from Cormac's question, I love food. And I would value all of its, I suppose, pleasurable and social qualities as much as its nutrient content. And again, really try in my practice not to just reduce food to its carbohydrate content, even though for some of today's presentation, I will have to do that. And finally, I don't carb police. And certainly today, what I'll be focusing on is the skills of carbohydrate counting, regardless of whether people choose to eat very small quantities or larger quantities or somewhere in the middle. So ambitiously, over the next 30 minutes, I'm hoping to cover something hopefully that everyone will be interested in. I'm going to cover the basics of carb counting for those of you that are either totally new to the area or just want to review. And then I'm going to go on to look at some of the challenges with carb counting, have some hints and tips maybe for managing those. And then I'd like to finish up by looking at the future, where carb counting maybe dovetails with some of the newer advances in management, in particular in relation to technology. I'm going to use CHO to denote carbs at some points in the presentation. And to borrow a phrase from the diabetes community, your diabetes may vary. So not everything I say is going to apply to everyone. So please bear with me on that. Okay, so starting with some of the basics. I suppose we know that a functioning pancreas produces a small amount of insulin all the time, and then it can upregulate or release more insulin in response to a rising glucose. The nutrient in foods that has the greatest direct effect on glucose is carbohydrate, but 90% of carbohydrate is converted to glucose within 1 to 2 hours of eating. For those of us with a functioning pancreas and without diabetes, this happens automatically. We don't even think about it. And then when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, we ask you to coin a phrase to think like a pancreas and use your insulin pens or insulin pump to try to replicate what would be happening if your pancreas was functioning. So I suppose the concept behind carb counting is that there is a relationship between the amount of carbohydrate you eat, or any of us eat, how much blood glucose levels rise, and then how much insulin we need. And if we can learn to count or quantify that carbohydrate, we can then learn to match our insulin, just like a pancreas, or maybe not quite that straightforward in reality. So research has shown that approximately every 10 grams of carbohydrate will increase blood glucose levels by about 2 to 3 millimoles in the first 1 to 2 hours after eating. So for some people it's less and some people it's more. And that holds true up to about 80 grams of carbohydrate. If we're eating meals with more than 80 grams at one time, it can certainly take longer for that carbohydrate to be digested and for glucose levels to rise, just because our tummy or our gastric emptying slows down when it's dealing with these larger portions. And then bolus insulin is designed to try to match this and have the opposing effect. So the idea, I suppose, is that an individual person can then work out their personalized ratio of bolus insulin to carbohydrate at its most basic. So what are the benefits of carb counting compared to using set doses of insulin? Well, in my book, one of the biggest benefits is, I suppose, for the mental health side of things and quality of life, because it makes eating the types of foods, the quantities of food, and the timing of food much more flexible and hopefully less restrictive. It's also been shown to help with getting HbA1c to target. Typically, studies show a 0.3 to 0.5% reduction in A1C and less variability with blood glucose in people that carb count. And as we look at how diabetes management is evolving, I suppose having solid carb counting skills seems to help people to get the best out of some of the newer technologies like pumps or CGMs. And a lot of diabetes services would probably recommend having a solid understanding of carb counting as a prerequisite to options like pumps. So when we're teaching carbohydrate counting, there's 3 basic steps. 1, identifying which foods contain carbohydrate. 2, quantifying how much carbohydrate you're going to eat. And 3, just considering how that food is absorbed and whether or not it matches with your insulin profile. And that's a much more straightforward process for the meal on the left, something like a chicken breast and salad with 2 very easily visible baby potatoes, than maybe for something like the food on the right, which is fried rice with a curry sauce. So step 1, at its most basic, we have foods that we know contain a significant amount of carbohydrate. So those on the left, and they would include breads, cereals, grains, potatoes, foods with sugar, foods with flour, fruit, and some dairy products. And then we have those that usually contain very little or no carbohydrates. So those on the right, including meats, poultry, fish, cheese, eggs, not all, but most vegetables, and fats and flavorings. That's step 1. Step 2 gets a little bit more complicated, and that's trying to quantify the amount of carbohydrate in the food you're about to eat. If a food has a label, that's generally helpful. So you're looking at the total carbohydrate content, not just the sugars. And then the tricky bit, I suppose, can be trying to quantify how much your portion is. So if a label tells you how much carbohydrate is in 100 grams, you then have to figure out, well, will I be eating 100 grams or 75 grams or 250 grams? And that's for weighing some foods, especially if you're trying to, I suppose, hone your carbohydrate counting skills, can be helpful for some people. Foods that don't have labels are very tricky. The carb content isn't always obvious from the appearance of the food. So for example, that ciabatta roll there in the middle contains almost as much carbohydrate at 50 grams as that medium portion of spaghetti bolognese. And if we look at all those breads, I always look at those and think, oh, it's the bagel that has the higher carb content just because it's more dense, but actually it's not. It's again the ciabatta. And then if you look at foods like ice cream, even though they taste sweet, they'll have a relatively low carbohydrate content. So one of the best resources you'll find to help you to work out the carb content of foods without labels is Carbs and Cals. I think it's become a real Bible for us in the diabetes world over the last kind of 10 years. They have a book which you can purchase or an app which you can download, which is about $5 for a smartphone or a tablet. The other totally free to download resource that I find is helpful is the carbohydrate reference list, which is available on the Diabetes UK website. And that has the carbohydrate content of hundreds of foods on there. We used to use it all the time before Carbs and Cals was available. So if you've identified the carbs and quantified them, you then, next step in carb counting is to add up all of the carbohydrate to estimate total carbs for the meal. So in this case, this individual had 18 grams from their porridge, about 13 grams from their OJ, and 20 grams from their banana. It's 51 grams. Just to mention, you will find that in some resources and in some diabetes services, total carbohydrate can be talked about in 10 or 15 gram portions, which we call CPs or exchanges. And that's done often for ease of calculation of your insulin to carb ratio. But I do know, I suppose, if you're totally new to this area, it can be a bit confusing. So if you've identified and quantified your carbs, the third step then is just to make sure that the insulin curve is going to sit well on the absorption of that food. And for the vast majority of foods, it does sit well. There are a few that are, if eaten on their own in particular, are almost too fast for your insulin. So they would be the foods listed on the screen now: glucose drinks, jellies, fruit juice, and mints. So they're absolutely ideal for treating hypos. And if you're eating them with other foods, you just count in the carbs, but they can be difficult to actually match with insulin because they're too quick. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have a small number of foods again that are almost too slow for your insulin. And they would include foods like peas, lentils, sweet corn, cherries, grapefruit, nuts, corn, and soya. So the usual advice with these foods is not to match them with insulin unless you're eating them in very large quantities. Once you've counted the carbs, you then apply a ratio, which is the amount of insulin you need to cover X grams of carbs and to deal with that increase in glucose over the 3 to 4 hours of the bolus. And that ratio varies a lot. We talk about this idea of a standard ratio being 1 unit to 10 grams, but in reality, it can vary from as much as 1 to 2 grams for people who are very insulin resistant, up to 1 to 30 grams for people who are very sensitive. And it involves just a lot of trial and error, I think, to figure that out for people. So that was very much a whistle-stop tour of the basics of carb counting. I think if you're new to carb counting or looking to upscale, I definitely would recommend booking a session with the dietitian on your diabetes team, if you have one, who'll be able to give you more detail and personalized support. Another really good option for learning about carb counting is attending a structured education course. So DAFNE is one of those courses, and that offers the advantage of peer support and learning in a very practical way with other people with type 1 diabetes. But if you can't access either of those for any reason, there are a number of reputable online options. So Bertie, which is from Bournemouth, and the AccuCheck online courses are really good. They're practical and quite interactive with lots of quizzes and testing your skills. The ebook that I mentioned from Diabetes UK or the Edinburgh Diabetes website are quite good if you like to learn through reading, because it takes you through the steps of learning about carb counting. And then the Diabetes Technology Network has some really good webinars if you like to learn that way through listening. So I'm going to move on now to look at, I suppose, some of the challenges with carb counting. So one of the biggest challenges, and it's a very obvious thing to say, is that some foods are just very tricky to either identify the carbs or quantify the carbs in the first place. So things like breaded versions of protein foods like breaded chicken or fish, chicken wings and sauces. So it may have a coating with carbs, and then how do you quantify how much of the dipping sauce you used? Soups and sauces, when you eat out, they may have added cornstarch or flour or sugar, which makes them higher in carbs than maybe the versions you might eat at home. And again, very practically difficult to quantify. And then snacks. So it's a very normal behavior for all of us to snack unconsciously in the world that we live in, where snacks are freely available. And then when you can't weigh foods, estimating all the time is very tricky. People tend to underestimate foods like pasta, rice, fruit, and cereals, and overestimate things like baked goods, ice cream, and potatoes. So I think there's no simple solution to all of these challenges, and I think the obvious solution as we move towards that is automated insulin release. and taking the heavy lifting out of asking people to be their own pancreas. But we're not quite there yet. So in the meantime, while people still have to do all of this heavy lifting with estimating carbs, I think one of the first things I always say to people when we're talking about this is you can only give it a go. It's very difficult to be 100% accurate all the time. And your diabetes team should certainly support you to use your insulin flexibly so that you can use corrections when things don't quite work the way you had hoped, and that's a very normal part of this management. I suppose there are some things that can help a bit with accuracy, and I'm going to take you through some of those now. Weighing foods can help. So my experience with asking people to weigh foods is that for some people, weighing their carb foods just becomes a fundamental and normal part of self-management. And for other people, it's an absolute head wreck and it takes the joy out of food. So it absolutely does help with accuracy, but I think people have to find where their own relationship with that sits, I think, and how often is maybe acceptable to you from a mental health perspective to check in with weighing. Really good tip I've gotten from the psychologists that are involved with DAFNE is that it helps us to hone our estimation skills if we guess the carbs first and then weigh to check rather than doing it the other way around. Because apparently as adults, we learn more from our errors. So if we make an estimate that's way off what it turns out to be, that seems to lodge a little bit better in our brains. In terms of I suppose, dealing with food labels, the other thing I've learned from DAFNE and working with people is that we all have very individual ways of working with food labels. So there are formulas that you can use, the carb content divided by 100 multiplied by the weight of your portion. But I think what I always encourage people to do is I feel it's time well spent to maybe sit with a couple of labels and figure out for yourself how you best do those maths and those sums. Are you somebody that needs a calculator or can you do it quicker in your head? Definitely recommend getting a copy of Carbs and Cals if you don't have one already. This is very boring, but sometimes doing a few days of logging carbs on your CGM or in a diary from time to time can be really helpful for checking and again honing those accuracy skills. For some people, using ready meals can be a good way to practice when you're eating out or maybe some of those more complex meals. So you're using a food that has a label to then give you a bit of a steer on how you might manage when you're eating a similar food that doesn't have a label. And then I find it's very helpful to have some of these 10-gram portions in my mind's eye, and you can download these images for free from the Carbs and Cals website. But if I'm looking at a plate of chips, can't weigh it and have to make an estimate, being able to think, well, okay, how many of this portion of chips is on the plate I'm trying to figure out here? Is there 4 or is there 10 of these? And again, it can just give me a bit of a steer in terms of accuracy. So I thought this was interesting to share in terms of how accurate do you have to be to get consistent results. Well, these are 2 studies from an Australian research group showing that 10-gram deviation either way doesn't actually seem to make a big difference at the end of the day. It's when you get up towards 20 grams of either under or overestimating that you start to get more hypos or higher than target blood glucose. So I don't know if that's good or bad news to hear, but I suppose for me, it's about that whole idea of trying to be as accurate as you can, but also being realistic about how accurate you can actually be. So all of the latest research seems to be showing that you get a better match of your bolus insulin to a standard carbohydrate absorption curve if you can take your insulin 10 to 20 minutes before you start to eat. And you can see on this graph here the difference in the peak with the red line, which was an early bolus, compared to the blue or green lines. But that does mean needing to predict how much you will eat, which isn't always practical. So I think the advice we give to people is do it when you can. That's not going to be all the time. But I do think, I suppose from my perspective as dietitian, it is an area where, again, having solid carb counting skills can help you to get the most from this self-management strategy. to more confidently correct if you don't finish the meal. So if, for example, you only ate half this sandwich, you would know if you're carb counting, well, I have about 20 grams to make up here if I've taken a pre-bolus, which again can maybe help a little bit with confidence to use those strategies and not panicking necessarily if you don't finish what you're eating. So what about non-standard absorption curves? So we've said that carbs have the most direct effect on blood glucose levels, but the other nutrients, fat and protein, can affect the absorption profile and your need for insulin, and they can cause what I'm going to call these funny non-standard curves. So I wanted to look at those in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to look at fat first of all. So high fat meals, which contain more than 40 grams of fat, have two effects on blood glucose. Firstly, the fat slows the rate of digestion. So glucose levels rise much more slowly after eating, and often the glucose peak is more than 2 to 3 hours after eating rather than in the first 1 to 2 hours. Fat also causes insulin resistance. So researchers think that can cause glucose release from your liver, meaning you might actually need more insulin than you've calculated for the carbs alone, but not immediately after eating. You can see this graph, the shape of the blue line, which was a low fat meal. So it's a very standard curve. And then it gets longer as the fat increases through 20, 40, up to 60 grams on the green line. So on the green line, you can see an hour after eating, the blood glucose has barely risen and it's only peaking really 3 hours later. Protein is similar. So large portions of protein can also delay gastric emptying and delay the peak of the curve. It also causes some insulin resistance, probably not as much as fat. And then some protein is converted to glucose, which again can increase the need for insulin. And the effect seems to be greater if the meal contains carbohydrate as well as protein. So if you have a mixed meal, 40 grams of protein can increase the need for insulin. Whereas if you have protein alone at a meal, it takes up to 75 grams to have an effect on the blood glucose levels. So what kind of meals are we talking about here? Well, if you're eating large portions, and we're talking getting up into 600, 700, 800 grams of standard meals like curry and rice or spag bol, just because they're bigger, they will proportionately increase the fat and protein content, sometimes to a level where they'll cause these funny curves. Or takeaway meals. So if you get bag of proper chipper chips and a burger, that's probably going to be over 120 grams of carbs, 40 grams of protein, and over 50 grams of fat. So again, it will cause these elongated curves. And likewise, large portions of lasagna, especially if we add a bit of garlic bread on the side, and of course pizza, which is the one that everyone gives out about, makes things very difficult to deal with your insulin. So how do you deal with these funny curves? There's a couple of methods. There's the Warsaw Pankowski method and the food insulin demand method. So both of these involve counting fat, protein, or energy in addition to counting carbohydrate and then applying a formula. Personally, I find these methods a bit complicated. I've referenced them today because I'm sure some people here are using them and finding them very successful. Personally, I have more experience and find it a little bit easier to explain the methods that are recommended by the ADA, where you use percentage increases in insulin on top of your carb bolus for these kinds of foods. So that's what I'm going to talk you through next. So it involves quite a bit of trial and error, but what they would recommend is that for a high fat meal, that you give about an extra 30 to 35% on top of the bolus you've calculated for your carbs. But then you split your total insulin, giving between 50 and 70% upfront, and then the other 30 to 50% over about 2 hours if you use a pump, or about an hour later if you use pens. And then again, you may need to adjust these up and down quite a bit and changing the upfront versus later, or the duration of the second part of the bolus to deal with these very elongated curves. This graph is from, I think it was actually from a closed loop study, but the blue line was what happened if you just gave a standard bolus for a high fat, high protein meal. And the red line was what happened when you use the kind of guidance I've just talked about. So you can see it can be quite effective. And then for high protein meals, so what they would say is either up over 75 grams of protein alone or over 40 grams if it's combined with carbs, you may need to allow about another 15 to 20% on top of your calculated carb bolus. And again, give it a little bit later or spread it. But do remember with the protein, you're talking about large portions here. So we're talking about 4, 5, 6 egg omelets. So this isn't something that you should need to do for something like your standard chicken sandwich. So the final bit of my presentation today, I'm just checking I'm okay time-wise. I'd just like us to consider for a couple of minutes how carb counting skills might sit with some of the newer diabetes technologies. So for me, it goes both ways. I think solid carb counting skills can help you to get the best out of technology, and technology can help you to get more accurate with carb counting skills. So continuous and flash glucose monitors can help you to identify patterns where they exist. And I've put that symbol in there because I did just want to, I suppose, take the opportunity to say patterns don't always exist. When we're talking about carb counting, we're talking about trying to identify patterns, but you can do the most accurate carb count, get the insulin spot on, and get a totally unpredictable result for no identifiable reason. And for us as healthcare professionals working in the area, I think it's important that we acknowledge that and normalize that more. But hopefully sometimes there are patterns. And for me, some of these technologies have just made it a little bit less onerous to identify them. You're not having to do days and days of self-monitoring blood glucose and keeping records. And hopefully then what that can mean is it allows you a little bit more headspace or energy to then think about how to change those patterns if they're not patterns that you're happy with. So again, thinking how your carb counting skills or adjusting ratios or looking at food composition for these funny curves might be contributing to the patterns. And the features on these devices where you can log your carbs and insulin can be really helpful from time to time to just delve down into that a bit more. So this is the CGM trace from a lady who I was working with who's getting a lot of hypos around exercise. And a bit of tracking helped us both to identify how her carbs and insulin were affecting that. And all of the devices differ in how you log. This is from a flash glucose monitor, where a few days of logging helped us to see that in this lady's case, the ratios were generally fine. It was the overnight insulin that was causing the problem. And if you're a pump user and using your bolus advisor as you go, as this woman who I work with was, then you can download your pump and again use some of the data to maybe look at carb counting skills or how those ratios are working. And if you're having this kind of week or month or year and can't see the wood for the trees and are feeling very overwhelmed with everything, often if you contact us, if we've established that you have the mental energy to look at this, our first protocol is often suggesting logging carbs and insulin for a couple of days so we can sit down together and try and figure out where we could change things up a little bit, if possible, to support you to get things into better shape. And finally, I suppose as we move into the world of better treatment options and closed loops, and I'll steal Gráinne's phrase here, to more forgiving options that will hopefully start doing some of this heavy lifting of being your own pancreas. I think solid carb counting skills at the moment do still help you to get the best from these devices, because most of them do still involve some kind of bolus announcement or bolus advisor or meal announcement. So I would certainly join all of you in looking forward to the day when everything I've said over the last 30 minutes becomes redundant, because all of this will become automated, but we're not quite there. We're getting there, but not quite there yet. So I hope that I've said a couple of things here today that might resonate with people and be helpful for you going forward in terms of management of your diabetes. So they are my slides done. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the
you.
share.
Thank you so much, Cathy, for that very good and informative chat. In fact, you answered a number of the questions that were coming up, but I think we might just go over a couple of things, because there were a couple of questions, for instance, on, let's say, eyeballing carbohydrate content. In fact, with one question about particularly for newly diagnosed people.
Yeah.
And they're continuing with that process. Can you maybe just go over that again? Just like you said, a very interesting there about, like, actually we learn more from our mistakes than we do from perhaps what we've read in a book. So could we maybe just go over that again for a few people?
Yeah, so I think what we would recommend, if you're newly diagnosed, or just trying to upscale on this, is definitely weighing sometimes. And what we'll recommend is that you put out your portion, eyeball it, and make an estimate, and then weigh. And that seems to help people to get more accurate, because if your estimation that you made, you thought, oh, I think there's 50 grams, and you weigh it and it turns out there's 120 grams, that lodges in our brains. We think, oh gosh, that was way off. So that seems to be a more helpful way to approach that. And I suppose there are other things, like having a scales in the house, having it out in the kitchen, so that it just, I suppose, maybe becomes a more normal part of what you do. With the proviso that, as I said, I think for some people it's not good for mental health, or it's unhelpful to weigh all the time. So it's a balance, I think.
And would you say then, in terms of dealing with the carbs, how would you deal with, say, instant to carb ratios or instant sensitivity factor ratios? There were a couple of questions around dealing with that. Also, would the instant sensitivity factor be influenced by the curve, let's say, if the delta of the curve, if it's going up faster, would that influence the instant sensitivity?
Yeah.
How to determine both that and the carbohydrate counting?
Yeah, I think it can. So I suppose, I think what you're talking about is that idea that if the bloods have been running higher, sometimes you're less sensitive to your insulin overall.
Correct. Sorry, Cathy, you're right. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think it's, if you're struggling with any of this, I think it's helpful usually to touch base with your diabetes service, because again, I suppose spending some time looking at some of those patterns can be helpful to figure out strategies. I think probably one of the biggest changes in the last 5 years, we have been moved, I suppose, towards recommending that pre-bolus idea where people can, and that really seems to help with that curve and the bloods maybe not getting up as high postprandially or after.
And how do you test for your carb ratios? Like, how does one go about doing that, testing what my carb ratio is or insulin sensitivity factor is?
Okay, so the way we'd recommend testing for your carb ratio is taking a defined amount of carbohydrate, and I would usually recommend to people probably doing something around the 30 grams, something that has a label on it, taking the ratio that you think is working, and then tracking, I suppose, what happens over the next about 4 hours. And what you're looking for is that the blood glucose has come back to where it started. If you're trying to do that with really big meals, the curve is just much longer, and I think it's more difficult to interpret. So that's usually my advice to people, is use something like a pre-prepared sandwich or a ready meal, or something quite definable that allows you then to test that out.
Okay. And just, you'd mentioned there, actually, just see there's someone coming in there about scales. Is there a scales that you'd recommend? But I just want to ask that. I'm sure you're going to have an idea what the answer will be, Cathy, but I got mine in little. I don't know if I should say that now. I'm not promoting anything anywhere, but any
scales, I think that works. I think, yeah, digital is obviously a little bit easier, and one that you can tear. So if you put your plate on and you can zero it again and put your food on top, that saves you having to try and subtract the weight of the plate and all that palaver that just, again, slows things down when your food is going cold.
How many days on average would you say you need for diary readings? Somebody asked there, that's usually about 3 days. Why 3 days? Maybe 5, maybe 7. Is there any particular day that you would recommend, or that is normal or usual?
Yeah, we would say between 3 and 5. And the reason we say that is, I suppose, if you're probably better with a shorter amount of good data rather than saying to yourself, I'm going to spend 2 weeks of logging, and then there's bits of information. It's quite onerous to ask yourself to log all your food, all your insulin for a prolonged period. So if there are 3, I'm going to use the term normal days where life has been reasonably stable, that should be enough to get a bigger picture view on what's going on.
And something I did want to mention, because it was a good question, is particularly for newly diagnosed people, Cathy, we're talking so much and focusing on food and measuring food. For new diagnosed people, how do you deal with eating issues, or even straying into the idea of eating disorder, that we don't want to become fixated with the idea of constantly monitoring food and constantly focusing on food? It could be a dangerous thing. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, so I think, again, if you have a concern that you're in any way veering into that territory, I think it's helpful to flag it to your diabetes team, and your diabetes team should be able to offer you additional support or possibly psychology referral to support you. I think for me, how I support people to kind of keep things balanced is the concept of flexibility. So I think it's really important to be flexible with how you think about all these self-management strategies with food. It's okay to go low carb, high carb, medium carb. It's okay to weigh sometimes, none of the time, all of the time. So these concepts of flexibility for me are kind of the key to that. It's not getting really rigid that the only way to do it is weigh everything all the time and be really exact all the time.
And for parents, Cathy, I mean, it's a new challenge as well, even for parents. I know for my own parents it was, in terms of dealing with this new diet that arrives into your home.
Yeah.
Like, you're trying to find that balance as a parent. Any kind of guidance even for parents dealing with that, maybe in new diets into the home?
Yeah. So I work exclusively with adults, so I don't have much experience with peds, but we'd have a lot of adults who had diabetes since they were kids. Again, I suppose that there seems to be something important about trying to normalize and not make the strategies that you're trying to use very different for that child compared to everyone else at home. And I think that varies a lot in terms of maybe how that fits practically. If that answers
yeah, sure.
very well.
And then, and can I just say then, pasta and bread are 2 big things that are coming up for people. So, okay. I see a slice of bread. I've been told it's half. The carbs are half the value of the bread. Pasta as well, dealing with labels of pasta. Is there an international standard, or is there an agreed standard? Is there a mistake factor built into that standard? So I suppose dealing with pasta and bread, well, how would you give us some tips on those 2 staples in all our diets?
Okay, so for bread, we would kind of use that idea that about 50% of the bread, regardless of whether it's brown or white or the type, will be carbohydrates. So if you can throw it up on a scales, that's probably the quickest way to do it. Or Carbs and Cals, which has a reasonable array of breads. The app is probably a bit better than the book because they do update it all the time. In terms of pasta, I think, so the question is there variance? So the studies would tell us there shouldn't be, that a pasta is a pasta. I think what's very tricky when you're eyeballing it in particular is a penne versus a fusilli versus a spaghetti. Just visually, they're very difficult. So they're
those pesky Italians, Cathy.
Yeah, or the little shells. So you can end up with 4 or 5 shells stuck on top of each other. So again, I think weighing where you can with pasta is probably the way to be most accurate with it. But just coming back to what I said in the middle, I think sometimes it's just impossible to get this right, and you have to say, I give it my best go. I'm going to give what I think is the right amount, and I may need to correct later.
Just, okay, 2 final questions. I think we're coming towards the end, but so firstly, dawn phenomenon, and I'm going to kind of tie in that as well, vegan diet and alternates to hypo treatments, and finally then online education, which you've mentioned. But so if we just say with dawn phenomenon, how would you deal with a dawn phenomenon? Is that a dietary question? I'm not sure, but
yeah, it's probably not dietary question. My understanding of dawn phenomenon is that it's hormonal. It's nothing really to do with what you eat. I suppose the best treatment, my understanding is that a pump is the best treatment for it. But I would say
in the mornings, are we more? What's our insulin sensitivity factor as a result of that hormonal change? Is that affecting what we should eat in the mornings in terms of how sensitive we are to insulin? Are we less sensitive, more sensitive?
Yeah, so we tend to be less sensitive in the morning because of that kind of hormonal stuff that's going on, and that's for everybody. You just see it if you have diabetes in the bloods. So most people need a higher ratio in the morning, or maybe need their insulin sensitivity factor can be a bit lower in the morning. They need more insulin to manage the blood glucose in the morning.
Thank you. Okay, and then just a funny and good question was, somebody's taking on a vegan diet. They need alternates to hypo treatments. And then I'm going to let you finish with, again, online education, just to tell people about those Bertie courses you mentioned, because a lot of people looking for online education. That would be great just to review that, just to close.
Okay, yeah. So as a dietitian, I should know lots about being a vegan, but I don't. So I'm going to take a punt here and say orange juice is probably suitable for vegans. I think what they mean is a lot of the jellies and gums probably aren't.
Correct. So that's exactly what they said. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say juice, and it's as quick generally as Luca said. And then the online education. Yeah, sorry. So there's a couple of options. One is Bertie, which is the Bournemouth Diabetes service, have an amazing online. You log on and you create an account, and it takes you through carb counting. Really, really good program. AccuCheck, which is Roche, have their own online program as well, which is good, and it's interactive again. And then there's the Diabetes Technology webinar, which again, if you Google them, you'll find them, and you can access them.
Will your links that you shared during these slides, and indeed even the slides themselves, particularly will the links that you shared, for instance, to that Bertie and Roche, will those links be supplied by, you're going to give them to Thriveabetes maybe and grow, and you might be able to share that with us all?
Yeah, no bother at all. Yeah.
Hi, so I think that's a perfect introduction. That's a perfect introduction there for Grania now to take over.
Yeah.
Thank you.